This is my podcast for how philosophy influenced social constructs, my research paper. Um, and I have a guest with me, my good friend, Om. He's very well versed in the topic of philosophy and religion itself, and happy to have you on, of
Yeah, thanks for having me.
course. Um, so let's get right into it, I guess. So, mainly, I wanted to begin with like the origins of philosophy because when we're talking about how it influences social constructs, I feel like it's important to really go back to where it starts. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think for sure that's it's a really good thing to talk about, especially how little it is discussed with like how philosophy came to be. Not a lot of people know this, but like philosophy is actually a lot more recent than religions are. Um, so one could definitely say that religions were a huge factor in the development of like more ancient societies. But with the introduction of philosophy, most people would argue that Thales was the first modern philosopher or the first philosopher in 1600 BC, or sorry, not 600 BC. And so around that time, philosophy became a real topic, something to be grounded and actually spoken about. And since then, it's shaped the world in pretty big ways. But the main thing with philosophy, and it's very similar with religion, is that it goes and tries to explain the world. I think it's a really interesting thing, or like really interesting characteristic that philosophy has. In the Hellenistic era, back in those days, philosophy started branching out and explaining other topics. And, things like epistemology and metaphysics became fields of philosophy. People started specializing in the area. And it became a more grounded, more um, applicable thing to the average person, um, more than what I would say religion could be, you know? Um, I think a great example of this is, I think it's Democritus. He was probably a great person in the early days to try and explain metaphysics and talk about like how things came to be.
Hmm.
Probably better than what you would say most religions do. Which a lot of
Okay.
people don't know this, but like he was the one who came up with the theory of atoms. And this is a guy
Oh
like who's
yeah.
probably never even seen like an ice cube in his life, but he somehow figured out atoms.
That's awesome.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, and what he basically did, and this is I think the origins of all philosophy really is he wasn't able to really see atoms, but he's able to think it through. And Democritus sees a rock, a giant rock, let's say, and he's like, okay, that's a boulder. And then if I cut that rock in half, it might be just a normal rock. And then if I cut that in half, it might be a pebble. And if I cut that in half or whatever, like further and further along, it might just be a grain of like sand, right? And you can just keep going down that chain. Democritus eventually says that there must be a fundamental thing, something that I can't name per se, something I might not even be able to see, but this particle, something, there must be something universally binding this thing together, and it must have like a lot of that thing in order for this rock to exist and be in front of me. And like him just using his like basic reasoning to try and explain the world and come up with the first theory of atoms, I think goes a lot further than what most religions could do at the time. It's it's not very helpful, I think, when you like study religions and they tell you, this is how the sun formed. God spoke the sun into existence. There's not much you can change about your life after knowing that fact. But something like atoms, something you could research, something you could look towards, something you could study the valence electrons of, the formations of these atoms, how they came to be, how they can be used to explain other things. It makes it so that philosophy is really like the foundation for
Hmm.
more innovation, not just for improving people's lives, but even like like exploration of the universe that we're a part of.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious to know what your thoughts on that are.
I agree with you. Like inherently philosophy gives people a lot of abilities to give themselves structure. Like you were describing in the Hellenistic period, like there was a lot of different branches of philosophy. People could express themselves and express their way of thinking in different ways, you know? People specialized in different levels of philosophy. And it actually ties into like my research thesis where it's like, it dates back all the way back to when the atom was first thought of, you know, and that's something philosophy offered people something that religion couldn't. It made it made the foundations that give us like social constructs that we have today. Um, which is like basically what my research thesis actually says. Um, and mainly like what I find interesting is the logical like almost breaking down of just natural things. Like, oh, okay, like what if I just cut this rock in half like 80 million times? There must be something fundamental that must bind things together. And people figured that out like thousands of years ago. Um which would not have been possible if it weren't for philosophy, I would think. And personally, I think that also goes into like what philosophy can do for people. One thing that like gets brought up, I think, a lot with philosophy, and maybe in like kind of a, how would I say, a very like misguided way, is self improvement. Like a lot of philosophy gives people self uh, introspection or like metacognition. They have the ability to look at what they've done in their life with kind of almost like an unbiased perspective, or as unbiased as you can possibly get, and logically like process what happened and kind of find the best way to go. And that mainly did start during the Hellenistic period, where those certain branches gave people ways on how to explain how they would live their life. Um, I'm curious to think of what I'm curious to see what you think of like introspection and how that really ties into philosophy compared to religion. Because personally, like I do see like some correlation between introspection and religion, but overall, like to me, philosophy, like across the board, and particularly education, which we'll get to later, really brings a lot to the table, way more than religion has ever done with those specific branches, at least.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. And one thing that I would say for sure is that philosophy has one major advantage that religion doesn't have, and it's merely because of the social construct that we have around religion. The way that one can talk about philosophy and the way that one can talk about religion is really, it's fundamentally different. People are socially more cued to be more, I want to say, hostile when it comes to religion. It would be one thing for me to attack your philosophy. It would be another thing for me to attack your religion. One is definitely a crazier thing than the other, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. And I think the fact that because you're allowed to critique other people's philosophy, that that lets you essentially form better thoughts by like kind of cross-examining what you're thinking with other people, right? You
Mm.
talk about introspection, you talk about being able to think about those ideas for yourself, but eventually your ideas have to like spread around. And so, you think about philosophy, you think about religion, and then you talk about it with other people, and their introspection and like their ideas are molded, and so they spread it to you, and like you uh kind of shape your worldview around not only what you think but what other people think. The I think the issue with religion a lot of the times is that if I critique a philosophy, it's easy. I can do it. And everyone would, well, no one would bat an eye if I told a stoic that I think their philosophy is stupid. But I think a lot of people would bat an eye if I told let's say a Christian person that I think their religion is stupid. That's a much
Mm.
more offensive thing to say, right?
Right.
And because you're able to cross-examine philosophy a lot more, you're able to just develop the field further and talk about it more often and like
Mm.
critique it and level it up, essentially, is the best way to describe that. We talk about the Hellenistic era that you were bringing up.
Mm.
One major school of the Hellenistic era was the skeptics. And if you talk about religion, I think what atheists are to religion is kind of like what skeptics are to philosophy.
Yeah, I would agree. I would
It's
agree.
that
Yeah.
no matter what you tell a skeptic in a philosophical debate, they don't take sides. They're just going to break down your idea.
Yeah.
So they really don't care about what you have to say, like at the very core. They're just trying their hardest to kind of refute the information and really just say at the end of the day that, you really don't know much at the end of the day. And that's hard to do with religion. It's hard to go to your religious values and say, at the end of the day, I really don't know. But with
Yeah, that's a
philosophy, you
big
can say
thing.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I definitely think that's a major advantage. There's the social context around philosophy is more vulnerable, it's more accepting of
Mm,
being wrong and adaptable. Whereas religion, there's not much room for adaptation. You can't be like, oh, the God created the earth on the fourth day. That's what my text tells me. And then suddenly we do research and oh, it actually turns out to be the fifth day. It either has to be the fourth day or the whole thing is wrong.
right.
Right.
Yeah, that's something that I find is a very big part of philosophy that religion can't offer is that ability to ideology itself, the way or how would it be? The philosophy itself is introspective. It's introspective on itself, if that makes any sense. It can be critical on itself, but religion, like when you say like, okay, like I think this part of religion is wrong, or like not necessarily, but like I think this event probably was just like didn't happen. That breaks down the religion. It builds on top of itself, and like you say, like okay, um, but for example, I'm trying to think. There was something you had said earlier that I felt was like perfect example of it. Like say to a Christian person, like I think your religion's stupid. Like it's seen as an attack almost because it's like you're saying my belief, the core of what I believe is to be right is dumb, which obviously is not probably what most people don't take as like an offense, but it can be, and I think it has throughout history been taken very seriously. But I think with philosophy, like there's been examples of like philosophers just really going at it and being like open to kind of changing their way of thinking. I think there was a book called The Lives of the Stoics by Ryan Holiday. He talked a lot about how the Stoics and that class of Hellenistic philosophy really had a lot of debates, and it was like fierce. You'd have like Plato, Chrysippus. I think there was a guy. His name was like Aristotle or something. Um, he started with an A. Um, either
Aristo?
Aristo, yes, exactly, Aristo, and he was like a very almost like a balancing like power in those debates. He was always like that. The devil. It takes the what was it called? Where you like take the opposite side of the argument. It's like he was
The devil's
always
advocate.
yes, he was the devil's advocate in like almost all those. I feel like if you did that in religion, you could like there's literally examples of people being burned at stakes for disagreeing with religion. But that
Absolutely. Yeah.
and that was able to be had in philosophy. Philosophy allowed for that. It actually embraced it most of the time, and that's how it developed. So I think that's why like the ideas developed very strong values of just introspection, whether you're across any branch of philosophy. And honestly, I think that not only kind of introduces the next topic, but I think one thing that is really um, integral to society in general is how both philosophy and religion have shaped education. Because I think where it starts, those ideas, where they begin, is in the classroom. I personally believe, whether it's with parents, I guess, because you could be introduced to it through parental activities like going to church or whatever. But I do think they're really reinforced in the classroom. What do you think about that?
Um, I would definitely agree. Um, at least in terms of the modern classroom, uh, one thing that a class could offer like an adolescent person is that it takes them away from where they grew up and it could bring them new ideas, you
Hmm.
know?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Um, and because of that, they're able to not only expand their horizons, be uh, bringing on new ideas into their like own core person, they're able to then cross reference those ideas to what they might have learned previously. So let's say that your parents might have raised you to believe something.
Hmm.
You can then have that child go to a classroom where, like, let's say it's more based on philosophy, probably true to be the case. Like, you wouldn't necessarily go to a classroom just to learn mostly religious things. It'd probably be more philosophical than anything
Right.
else. And because of that, they would then go and they would cross reference what they learn in the classroom and then what their parents taught them and what they think themselves. And they mix that all together and they, like, spit out maybe perhaps an original idea or, any other product of those ideas combining together or like evolving with each other. And
Hmm.
that's something that um like philosophy like uniquely would bring to the table, because oftentimes what it would be if you're only taking, let's say, from religious values, is that I have my religious values and then I have my academic values, and like no matter what, my religious values could not crumble to the academic values.
Yeah.
Whereas
Oh,
philosophy could definitely be undermined by any academic or religious values that you are introduced to
mm,
the table, right? A great example would be like maybe your parents just didn't really teach you many good manners, right? And then you go to
mm,
school, and that's where students are behaving, or like kindergartners are interacting with like other kids the same age as them for maybe the first time, and they learn about very basic philosophies, the golden rule, treat others as you want to be treated, and things like
mm.
that. And those govern the classroom. Those ideas pretty much dominate the classroom at those early stages. And so, yeah, I definitely think that like philosophy is very integral to the academic environment. Absolutely.
Yeah. One particular case that I actually personally think about a lot when like building the environment of a classroom, because in my opinion, I think it's kind of hard to determine like how much religion over philosophy has an impact on how a kid learns, or not how a kid learns, what is learned in a classroom, because every classroom's different. But one of the foundations of like modern day education is John Dewey's philosophy on like how classrooms should be built. He really like stresses the idea that like teachers need to be that guide for students. And it's almost, he takes from the roots of philosophy back all the way in the Hellenistic period to like that present day, or at least at that time modern day, um educational institutions, and he brings that with him, and he's just saying like the job of the teacher is to instill this knowledge into the kids. Like the job of the teacher is to make sure the environment's constructive. So like for example, like self-introspectives, like constructive criticism, um it's beneficial for the child. There's no like lack of guidance. um and I feel like that one is a very cool example of like how philosophy has really impacted one of the biggest figures, and I'm fairly sure John Dewey was one of the most, if not the most popular American scholar of his time, um, especially in like education and all that. And
Yeah, absolutely.
it's yeah, and honestly, like it really, in my opinion, it really, you can see it when you're in school, like how it shapes the way a school system functions. In my opinion. Um. All right, we can move on. Honestly,
Sure.
I think, yeah, we'll move on to the next topic. Philosophy's shaping of the modern mind compared to the religious mind. I actually quite like this one. Um, because I feel like I feel like maybe it's phrased weirdly, but like the impact that philosophy has on and this is more like education wise, but like we have previously said, I think this one is a little bit easier to quickly go over. Is like what philosophy is offered is that cross examination, that that ability to be crucified, or not crucified, criticized, but almost the I wouldn't like to say the religious mind, but religion is kind of just like specifically only towards that day 4 It has to be day 4. It doesn't happen at all, or it falls apart. Um, but that one, honestly, I don't really feel like we should touch on much.
I did have something to at least
Oh,
touch on that one.
okay, go ahead. Yeah.
We talk about like philosophy being able to be cross-examined with other philosophies, and like that's how they evolve and become better.
Mhm.
I think another good, I guess, somewhat related point to that is that philosophies don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I think that's the difference between like the philosophical mind versus like the religious mind, is that as a philosophical mind, you're allowed to be a cynic, a stoic, a skeptic, a nihilist, or
Or a
any
Buddhist,
version of
you know.
philosophy. Right? You're allowed to be anything that
Um,
that your philosophy like says.
mm,
In fact, you can even create your own philosophy if you really really wish to.
right.
Um, but you're not allowed to do that for almost every religion. The religious
Mm,
mind has to take sides.
it's
For
exclusive,
them to
right?
accept one, they must also disavow the rest.
That is
Um,
true.
and that kind of eliminates the idea of diverse thought from the table, right?
Mm,
Um, this is not necessarily a critique of any specific religion, rather a critique of religion overall. Is that because you take a side, now you don't know what the other teams have to offer, essentially, right? Um, and I think going back to the whole the social issue of like the religious versus the philosophical is that oftentimes people will be born a certain fan. Let's say your parents are the fans of the Steelers, so you're also a Steelers fan, right?
mhm. Right,
Chances
right,
are,
right.
if you're born religious or if your parents are religious, you're also going to be religious, right? And almost never, as a Steelers fan, would you watch another football team's games, right? You wouldn't have a chance to be a fan of another game or another team, I should say.
Right.
And because of that, it kind of limits you. Your parents were a Steelers fan, their grandparents were a Steelers fan, you're also a Steelers fan, but like you
Mm,
never got a chance to really explore that. And religion makes it very predominantly the case that those things have to be mutually exclusive. You're not allowed to like the Steelers and like the Browns. You
right.
have to like
Yeah.
one.
You only get to choose one
And
side.
exactly, yeah, they all contradict each other. They all say something that the other one can't have, and so therefore you choose one or you choose nothing.
Mm. Yeah, that is a good point. I actually quite like how that was said. It's very interesting to think about how religion really just makes you have to be mutually exclusive to that idea, where philosophy is more open to multiple ideas or even just a singular one, but at least it's open to ideas. And in a sense, it's just more open to development. And I think that's important when thinking about how societal, like, social constructs are formed, because as I discussed in like my essay and like during my thesis, I think philosophy, because of those factors, really give it that extra push. Say this is something that not only it just overshadows religion because of its just ability to be malleable, applicable to every situation that you really think of. Um, and I feel like it's like almost more common than we really think. Um, and actually, I think it's really, really common in politics and like economics. Honestly, for example, back in like the Roman Empire days, philosophy was a really big factor, in my opinion, at least. And through my research that I had found to be a really big factor in the decision making and the actual economics of the Roman Empire. Um, Obviously, during that period of time, it wasn't really the idea of secular philosophy wasn't a big thing. That only came around during like Age of Enlightenment, stuff like that. So 2,000 years off, but the ideas were still at their core philosophical. They weren't really attributed to religion, even if they had theistic kind of correlations, if you will. So I'm curious to what you think, um, as our guest expert today. What do you think of the political and economical effects of philosophy, and how religion also, how it's compared to religion? How about that?
Yeah, I think politically and economically, you could definitely make the argument that philosophy does a lot, and almost yeah, like every anyone who's read like something about the Enlightenment knows, that to be the case. That like those ideas seriously shape the new world, what you would call it, right? And the ways that like most modern governments function. Um, but I guess I do want to play devil's advocate for a bit because we've been so critical of religion, with the whole idea of philosophy versus religion in terms of like political, economical, and just like human affairs.
Hmm.
I definitely think that there is no greater force than religion when it comes to mobilizing groups to do something, you know,
Mm.
and for everything economical, political, all those kinds of things, you'll definitely see it to be the case that if you want crazy radical movement, it's almost never philosophical. We only saw that during the Enlightenment. It took thousands and thousands and thousands of years of philosophy to finally get the Enlightenment to where a radical change was made through philosophy.
Mm.
However, that's been happening for so much longer with religion. Um, and you can see that just with everyday modern examples, let's say. I don't think it's any mistake that almost every single major nonprofit is a religious foundation or like
Mm.
has some kind of religious value attached to it, right? At the end of the day, say what you want about religion, all the good, all the bad that it comes with. It's oftentimes the case that a religious person will be more generous when it comes to donating their time, donating their money to help people, versus, let's say, a purely philosophical person. Because the issue with philosophy is that it doesn't mobilize. You can listen to the Hellenistics and like all of those teachers as much as you want. Those teachers oftentimes don't tell you to go out and do something. Whereas with the religious, um, almost every other page encoded within any religious text is here's what you should do. And in fact, here's what is going to happen if you don't do this. If you're not a generous
Mm.
person, God is not going to look favorably towards you. If you're not forgiving, God is not going to look favorably towards you. All these other kinds of things.
Mm.
And regardless of the origins of those things, at the end of the day, the religious mind is oftentimes more impactful, whether it be good or bad, towards uh, any human affair, any economic situation, any political situation. More governments, are overthrown for religious reasons than philosophical reasons.
That is true. Yeah.
um, and so I think there's definitely something to say about the power that religion has, where philosophy definitely loses a grasp to really get things done, as practical as it may be.
Mm.
It at the end of the day, one of its biggest weaknesses is that it's so practical, but it doesn't do much.
Right. No, I could actually really do see that. Especially like the mobilization aspect. Like you think of like the Holy Crusades. I think it's like Crusades on like Jerusalem or something. Like
Yeah,
that was because of, if I'm not mistaken, Christianity or Catholicism. I can't really remember. Or
Catholicism.
Judaism. Was it Judaism? No, Catholicism. Okay. Um, and like most mobilizations of people have been for religious reasons. Like you got to think, like me personally, like I grew up Catholic, so like my grandma would make me go to the Stations of the Cross, and that's something where everyone out of the church goes out and carries a cross all around the town, and that's at a small scale mobilization. So I would agree with you on that. Like religion does mobilize people, but I think in a sense, at least in terms of the Roman Empire, obviously I think nowadays you can look back and just be like, okay, like certain kingdoms were very, 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 very religiously influenced, like the Kingdom of Poland, not the Poland of King, the Kingdom of Poland. or the old kingdom of Poland was like very, very influenced by religion, specifically Catholicism. And but I do think for the Roman Empire, like there was really significant figures in political positions that embodied philosophy. Um, One of them, and probably if not the most popular one, is Seneca. Seneca was a Roman senator, and he wrote works on philosophy all the time, and tried to embody it. And being someone in that high of power of position, he was a big factor in a lot of political and economic decisions. And there's also another one named Marcus Aurelius, and he was a Roman emperor and a Stoic philosopher. As you know, I'm just kind of repeating information for people listening. Um, he wrote a book called he wrote a set of diaries that were translated into a book called the Meditations, and that's his almost Stoic journey as the Emperor of Rome. Someone who could literally do anything he ever wanted. If he said, "I wanted this," it was done. And someone with immense power. He had infinite power during that time period, and he relied on philosophy, not religion. So I think for the Roman Empire, at least for that period of time, it was overwhelmingly philosophical and philosophy based, with some religious aspects, because obviously back then deistic ideas were still popular, and that's how ancient civilizations were. About even not even a few hundred years ago, that started not to be the case. So yeah, I would agree with you on that. Any closing thoughts before we move on to our final one, because we are running a little bit low on time?
Sure. I will say something really quick there. I totally agree with the whole idea of Marcus Aurelius, being more philosophical than religious when it comes to his own personal, um, I want to say, litigation as a Roman emperor. He definitely drew towards more philosophical ideas. I definitely think that that sets a big precedent um, for the power that philosophy had, or I guess it would still have, is that a Roman emperor is looking to these specific ideals for ways to guide him, and those are shared amongst everyone that would be within the society. So um, just as Marcus Aurelius would see philosophy from being the most important person, you could say, or the most powerful person in his society, um, someone at the very bottom, let's say like a slave of the Roman Empire, could see the exact same thing. And in fact, a lot of debates were had between people from very high up and very low during those times. We had Epictetus. He was a slave
Ah,
during the
yes,
exact same time,
Epictetus.
and those Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus both studied the same philosophy. They both were major factors when it came to modern day Stoicism and how it shaped to be, but they were on opposite rungs of the Roman society. One was a slave, the other was a Roman emperor, and yet they were both looked at on equal playing fields as if only their ideas really mattered rather than anything else. And I
Mm,
think that's another major advantage, is that there's no prerequisite status with philosophy. Whereas you could say with religion, there's ranks, there's popes,
mm.
and there's
Bishops,
other,
popes, yes.
or yeah, bishops, yeah, exactly. And there's something definitely to be said that, like, oh, only the pope can bless people, and then, like, with these like sacred things that they might have, whereas your everyday person couldn't necessarily do something like that. There's a reason that people ask for the pope's
Mm.
forgiveness for something rather than any
They're
any
priests.
passerby
They're
on the
neighborhood
street.
priests, right?
Exactly, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
the very idea almost is not very equivocal. It doesn't set everyone on the same playing field, whereas
Mm.
I think with philosophy it definitely has more opportunity to do so.
Yeah, I'm thinking of quite a bit of things right now. Um, to me, religion, at least for Catholicism, or yeah, it's really just tied. Your value of your blessing, if you will, is tied to your rank. like, oh, I want to be blessed by this bishop. He's higher ranked than this priest that I have in my neighborhood. But like, I really love the example and the almost dichotomy between Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. You've got literally the lowest of the low of the Roman Empire, like debating with the dude who has the most power in the world at that time. And what matters is their ideas. It doesn't matter what social class you were. It doesn't matter who you were. It was the quality of your ideas that made that gave you almost, I don't want to say value, but gave you the ability to communicate and develop. Um, I don't think that's right. It kind of gave you the ability to just be equivalent to others. Whereas I think religion kind of gatekeeps a lot of information or just ability to do things because your rank isn't high or your commitment to the religion hasn't been long enough. Like for like the Pope, like obviously Pope Francis recently died, and they chose another Pope that was, I think it was around 40 years in the in the religion as like a bishop or whatever, but 40 years of commitment to the thing, to the religion, gave him the ability to have that rank of being a pope. But for philosophy, you really have the ability to be critical of yourself and just be um have really high quality ideas, and that would get you to that level where you could just talk to and communicate with the Roman emperor, if per se you were in that time, right? um
Yeah, for sure. There's no prerequisites to philosophy. You don't have to be born of noble blood or to study for a certain amount of time. If your ideas are good, they'll be heard.
exactly, yeah, and they spread. um all right, so I would like to get to our final bit, which I think we've already touched on a little bit, is the idea of secular philosophy and enlightenment, and how that really like turned the tables for religion during, like, I think it's right, it's post puritanical period. People in America, early America, were very very religious. Obviously Puritans were very 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 religious. And then the Age of Enlightenment came around like 17 something, maybe it's 18. I don't remember. But
Yeah, it's 17th, 18th century. You got it.
oh, okay, we're good. Um and that came with secular philosophy, like, or it reinvigorated and reignited that already present, almost secular philosophical or secular ideas. Let's just put it that way. Um as some final closing thoughts, what do you think about the way it kind of impacted religion at that time? Because I think it really changed how people viewed social constructs at that time. Like, people thought like, you have to go to church, you have to do these things, or else God will like smite you. um, Obviously, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but it was believed that like you disobeyed God during the puritanical period, the end would come. Like the I think it's like the Great Flood will come and it'll wipe humanity out. So like you gotta be perfect, or else they're gonna burn you at the stake. They'll kick you out. They'll um isolate you. You know, and I think that's it's a big part, a big shift in society when secular philosophy was being reintroduced and people started actually like kind of bringing that and embracing it. So what do you think?
Um, yeah, I definitely agree that there was a radical movement of secular philosophy that really changed like modern ideas. Um, and I'd have to say that it's definitely the Enlightenment and its ideas of trying to almost more individualize the whole idea of religion and compartmentalize it a little bit.
Okay.
I think the philosophers at the time realized that in order to form a more cohesive society, you couldn't really incorporate the two if you wanted to. you know, as modes of transportation get better and better, as people of different lifestyles and races and religions and backgrounds come together more and more often, it's really hard to govern a group of people based off of one set of religious ideas, right? And so I think
Mm,
that secular philosophy definitely opened the way for more different diverse groups of people to essentially bring forth ideas and clash with each other, and also form something new, form something that is a blend of different ideas that they've all brought together. um and that was definitely going to be the case, but I think we're definitely at least lucky to have it happen so early within like the foundation of
mm,
like modern government.
yes, I agree.
um because that would have never been the case if everyone's walls were closed off
Right,
and
right, right,
no one was allowed to see each other, and there was no such thing as like a ship that could get you from point A to point B across the ocean, right? then
right, right.
then there wouldn't be any reason to do so, and you could just definitely have philosophy that was more religious, you could say. But yeah, it was definitely brought upon because of the new age of technologies growing and it almost having a need to be brought about, rather than I think
Mm,
the other way around, where it was this um, new idea that came out of nowhere. Like you said
mm,
earlier, it was almost reintroduced,
mm.
the whole idea of bringing the secular philosophy into the people.
Right. Yeah, I would agree, and I think it was born out of necessity rather than like born as like a new thing. It was just like, there's a ton of new people coming to this place. There's new ideas, new religions, new types of people. We need something else than just this. And especially with the way the Puritans and just religion was run back then, it was very, I would say, strict. Pretty strict compared to nowadays, I would say. And like, you were ostracized if you didn't believe or didn't kind of, what would you say? Not be cohesive, but like if you didn't homogenize into that type of society, you were different, you know. So I think it was born out of necessity. Um, so yeah, I think that pretty much wraps up, you know, this podcast style episode of how philosophy influence social constructs and how it connected to my thesis and how
Awesome, I'm glad to talk about it.
of course I'm happy to have you on, man. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.